So today we're extremely thrilled to bring Brian Klapper here to Google. He is the founding partner of the Klapper Institute. He's the author of the book that we're listening in on today, the Q-Loop, the art and science of lasting corporate change. And over lunch, I had a really great conversation with him, and one of the things that we picked up upon is that change is something that all organizations face as they increase in years and increase in size. And really, adaptation to change is important, but what is even more important is just providing a framework for these ideas to be expressed instead of repressed. And so as companies grow, it's very critical that they stay nimble. And so the Q-Loop outlines ways that companies in all industries can adapt to that strategy. So we will have some time for some Q&A in the end, but in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Brian to Google. So thank you very much. All right.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I thought I'd start with a personal story to kind of let you know how I got into this business of change, something that Cliff and I were talking about over lunch. And for me, it started, I was a partner in one of the big strategy firms for many years. And we were given the honor of working for a major money center bank directly for the CEO. And we spent a year working for this guy, and he asked us, he said, I'll give you a blank check, but what I want you to do is develop a strategy for me that'll help me reinvent banking for the 21st century. As a strategy guy, it just doesn't get better than that. That's as good as it gets. It's a white sheet of paper. It's a blank check. It was fabulous. Spent a year working for the bank. We had teams and teams of analysts producing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of models and economic and financial analysis. And by the end, we finally presented to him. Picture a very large conference room, polished mahogany. It was magnificent. The partners were in the room, presented to the CEO, and at the end of the presentation, he smiled and he said, I'd like to congratulate you folks on maybe the most brilliant, insightful piece of strategy I've ever seen. I said, well, thank you, that's great. He takes the deck, throws it against the conference room wall, the binder clip opens up, all of the pages scatter around, and he tells us, I don't think it's worth the paper it's printed on. Nevertheless, the tens of millions of dollars I spent with your firm. So we said, okay, A, can you go back to the point of how brilliant we were, because that was a much more enjoyable conversation, but I guess B, why not? And he said, you know what? I think I understand 85% of what's in here, and I think I'm a pretty clever guy. I have 160,000 people that work for me. What am I supposed to do with this? What do I tell them to do with this work? And so one of my partners volunteered and said, well, if you look at chapter 47 of the deck, you'll see that there are Gantt charts and PERT charts and roles, responsibilities, guidepost jobs, accountability. We have all of that. And he said, that's not what I'm talking about. What do I do with this? How do I get 160,000 people to basically sing off the same hymnal? I don't get it. So, flew back home, pretty dejected, inconsolable, actually, for the entire weekend. And then my wife said to me, you know what? I think he probably gave you the kindest gift that any client has ever given you. I said, what are you talking about? This was a disaster. I said, okay, what gift? He was honest. I wonder how many of your other clients felt the same way that he did. You did some highfalutin strategy work, but at the end of the day, they couldn't implement. I said, you don't know what you're talking about. My clients love me. Repeat business, long-term. She goes, okay, I'm sure you're right. Okay. But I was thinking about it, and I actually decided to then go ahead and audit my former clients to find out what percent actually got that full value of the work that we had created for them. And lo and behold, it was like 16%. So I quit 2 days later. I said, I can't do this anymore. So I decided I want to get out of the ideas business and actually get in the trenches with clients and help clients really implement change, because that's something that, quite frankly, companies large and small, young and old, always have a difficult time doing, is really driving change through their organization. And there are many, many reasons for that, and that's what I want to spend most of our time talking about today. What are some of the reasons why change is so difficult for different companies, and why there's so much talk and so many great ideas, but organizations don't always receive the full benefit of all those ideas. So as an example, suppose you know of two artists. one of whom has brilliant ideas and always takes those ideas and puts them down on paper and translates them into beautiful, beautiful pieces of work. The other artist has equally brilliant ideas, but they never make it down to the canvas. I think we could all agree that the first artist is, in fact, a brilliant artist. But what of the second? I guess I would argue the second artist isn't really an artist at all. He's a talker. And there's a very big difference between being a talker and being an artist. And what I've seen when I visit so many companies is companies love to reward the idea. And they mistake brilliant ideas for constructive action. And that becomes a problem. And people often get promoted not on their ability to actually drive change through an organization, but more on their ability to generate ideas. And so why is that, and what's the difference? Well, ideation is fun, right? I mean, especially at a company like this, right? Who doesn't love kicking around ideas? It's a great time. It's fun. The challenge, though, is implementation is hard. It involves changing people. It involves influence. It involves changing org structures. It's very different having an idea and getting an idea fully implemented. And one of the reasons, quite frankly, is a fear of failure. There's not a lot of failure at the ideation level. Failure comes at the lack of implementation level. I recently heard this really interesting story, or I liked it anyway, and it was of a 6-year-old girl. And the 6-year-old girl never really paid a lot of attention in her core subjects. But she was sitting in the back of the room, diligently focused on some drawing that she was making. So much so that the teacher said, I really want to investigate what this girl's doing, because I've never seen her focus quite this way before. So she goes back and she talks to the little girl and she says, "Excuse me, what are you working on?" And the little girl looks up in disgust and says, "I'm drawing a picture of God," and goes back down to her work. To which the teacher replies, "But we don't know what God looks like." And the little girl looks up and says, "You will in a minute," and goes back down to work. On a more personal note, my wife and I were going through our DVD collection, and we decided for Mother's Day this past year, we wanted to give our mothers a compilation DVD of our kids growing up through the years. And we came across one of my youngest daughter, Danielle. She's now 13. She was in kindergarten. And the teacher asked the entire kindergarten class, "Who knows how to make a Thanksgiving dinner?" Out of nowhere, my daughter's hand shoots up, and I look around. She's the only one in the class with her hand up in the air. Not always right, but always certain, my Danielle. And so she raises her hand, teacher calls on her, and without prompting, she stands up because she needed to be an orator for this answer. And she stands up, and she says, "I know how my parents do it. First, they get a bunch of turkeys. Then they get a bunch of pilgrims. They stuff both the turkeys and pilgrims with stuffing so they're fat, and then our family eats them all." Not quite the way things work in our family in Connecticut, but nonetheless. So what do the two stories have in common? Between the little girl drawing the picture of God and my daughter Danielle convinced that we're cannibals. They don't feel failure. Kids never feel failure. They only see the upside. They never consider the downside. And that's probably something, as we get older, we recognize that decisions and ideas have consequences. But not to the kids. What I see so often in so many companies is so many companies try and stigmatize failure. I'm working with a client now who says, "We've always been a company that likes to take 3 shots and score 3 goals. I want to be a company that takes 10 shots and scores 7 times." And that's a great ambition, unless you're one of those 3 people that shot and missed. So the question is, how can you, because if you're not willing to fail, you'll never come up with something new. You'll never come up with something innovative. So how do you build an organization? How do you build a process that allows for failure? I would argue that even encourages failure, pursues failure, in a way that promotes creativity, promotes ideation, and ultimately promotes implementation. Now, failure is part of change. And when you do the research, you'll realize that over 70% of all company-wide change efforts fail to deliver their intended results. And that's something small, like we want to improve our time to market for new products, or something large, we want to transform our entire organization. 70% of all efforts fail. And when I talk to C-suite executives, what they tell me is, we have fabulous people. Our corporate culture is terrific. Our technology is fine, if not better than fine. Yet why is it so hard for me to get anything done around here? I've got 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people, all presumably going in different directions. I can't get them galvanized around some of the major issues that I'm looking for in my organization. Why is that? And when you dissect it, the roadmap for change is actually relatively straightforward. You create a vision, a strategy, communication plan, and then ignite people to execute. Well, the vision, executives don't get promoted to executive positions without being visionary. So most executives have that box checked. Strategy, there's been tons written about strategy, firms built around strategy, also something not terribly difficult once you have a vision. Communication plans, there are dozens from which to choose. You can go on the internet and find a million of them. Again, not terribly challenging. The question is the last one, and this is where they all break down. 85% of the 70% break down in the inability to ignite an organization around a theme around change. And that's the challenging part. Yet, if you don't change, and if even as a company, if you're not able to change and make change an ongoing part of your core capability, you're going to have an issue. Interesting statistic. Back in 1917, only one of the Forbes greatest companies performed better than average, average in this case being the S&P 500. And 85 of those 100 are dead. They are no longer in business. I find that both frightening and sobering. Especially because what does it take to become one of the Forbes top 100 companies? You folks would know. Great products, great people, great ideas, great market position, in some cases, great location. So you've got everything going for you. Yet 85% are no longer in business. As Michael Collins has said, it's not because of what the world does to these companies. It's what the companies do to themselves that causes them to fail. When you peel back the numbers, some interesting themes emerge. 3 primary ones as to why these companies are out of business. Number 1, adherence to a business model that's no longer relevant. So the marketplace changed, the business model didn't, and the company went out. Blockbuster. Secondly, the company took its eye off the customer ball. So how do you make money, right? You meet the needs, both the implicit and explicit needs of customers, both what they want now and even what they don't know what they want. And to the extent you can anticipate what customers want, that'll be a successful business model. Companies took their eye off that particular ball. Consumer tastes change, companies didn't, they went out. In that same bucket, it's companies that tend to design products more for themselves than for customers. Full risk to that particular model. Third and last is companies lost out to more nimble competitors. What was once the new thing stopped becoming the new thing. And as a result, they had a talent drain, they had a brain drain. And some of their most creative people got frustrated working in what was once a very entrepreneurial organization, and they left to either start their own firms or to work in companies that represented the ideal, which was the company that they thought they joined. So those are the 3 primary reasons why you see organizations change. Gary Hamel, in his book, Leading the Revolution, had a great quote. This was going back probably 15 years, even before Amazon became relevant. And he was commenting on Walmart. And he said, how many people think the retailing revolution will stop with Walmart? Who amongst us wants to spend our time walking around the soulless canyons of a Walmart looking to save $10 on a hammer? And he hit it right, because if you think about where did we buy hammers when we were kids? Probably the local hardware store. And then where? the big box retailer, and then Kmart, and then Walmart, and then Amazon. And where is it going to go? Who knows? 3D printers, maybe. Who knows where it's going to go? But it's not going to stop with Walmart. Let me ask you a question. Does anybody know, back in the 1960s, early 70s, what the largest restaurant chain in the United States was? Not McDonald's, young man. Howard Johnson's. Anyone ever hear of them? Red Roof, orange sherbet, popularized in Mad Men. Howard Johnson had over 1,000 retail restaurants around the United States on the most popular highways. They had the best location of any of them. They were the #2 food producer after the US Army. And their market share was larger than McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC combined. And what was their business model? Bring your kids in, have a nice, comfortable meal, relax, take your time, and we'll serve you good food at a reasonably good price in a very relaxing, enjoyable setting. Now, imagine that you've got a larger share than McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC combined. You've got the best location, you've got fabulous products, and your customers love you. So imagine you're the board of directors. You're sitting in a board of directors meeting for Howard Johnson's. And an analyst comes in who's responsible for competitive research and says, folks, I think I've seen the future. And this is our biggest competitor. It should strike fear in your hearts. That's our competitor. What's your reaction? You gotta be kidding me. The clown? I'm gonna get taken out by the clown? And you obviously know how the story went. So what happened? Why did the clown win? Women were getting into the workforce. Time became a commodity. People didn't have the time, nor the patience, nor the interest to spend with their families eating long family comfort meals. They wanted quick, they wanted cheap, they wanted to get in and get out. And there was no place better positioned than Howard Johnson's to take advantage of that. Yet the clown won. So I wrote this book, The Q-Loop. And the Q-Loop was designed to really offer a process of ideation through implementation. And people say to me, why a Q? What's with that? And it's the flow of ideas, or what should be the flow of ideas, but isn't always. So at the top of the queue, I like to think of the top of the queue as the top of an organization, the senior management. There's nobody more visionary, there's no one that should be looking out over the horizon more than your senior managers. And they do, for the most part. Ideally in the Q-Loop, though, they would then start organizations on what I call an idea quest. Come up with a focused mission, and then bring that idea quest, that vision, down to the bottom of the organization, down to your frontline people, your first and second level supervisors. That could be a wellspring of ideas for the organization, and is almost never used. Then back up to the top of the organization for resourcing and staffing, and then back down one more time for piloting, and then out the queue for implementation and firm-wide rollout. One of the questions I ask when I'm in these kinds of meetings is, I talk about a concept that I'm quite fond of, and it's called organizational IQ, collective IQ. And the notion there is, let's say you've got an organization of 10,000 people with an average IQ of 120. That's 1.2 million IQ points available to the organization. And when I ask senior executives, what % of that 1.2 million IQ points do you take advantage of in your decision making, your ideation, your input into strategic planning for the most important decisions your company makes, what do I get? 1 to 5%. Ideas, visions come from the top of the organization, and they stay in that very top of the queue, and they never make it down to the lower ends of the organization. And why does it matter? Well, because your folks that are on your front lines are the ones closest to your customers. They're the ones that witness millions and millions and millions of customer interactions, and you know what they do with them? Typically, absolutely nothing. They keep them to themselves. They are busy typically protecting an organization from the customers. Nobody wants to see how the souffle is made, and that's what your frontline workers do. I call them heroes. because they're the ones that prevent your customer from really peering inside to how things really work in most organizations. And it's a vast treasure trove of information that is almost never taken advantage of. And I think that's a big shame. In addition, you're asking these people to implement your ideas. How many people love to implement someone else's ideas? Show of hands. Few people like to implement other people's ideas, but people fall all over themselves to implement the ideas that they had a hand in creating. Why wouldn't they? And especially if you're frontline first-level supervisors, these are the people where the pragmatism exists. They're not in the ivory tower up on the top floor of an office building. These are the people in the trenches that are going to war every day on behalf of the company. So there's huge pragmatism that exists on the front line. And all of the ideas that would come from these people typically are very pragmatic in nature and easy to implement. So if you follow the Q-Loop concept, it's vision up front, ideas come from the front line, up to the front again for resourcing, for span of control, for prioritization, back down for testing, and then out for implementation. And yes, testing is extremely important. Ask JCPenney what happens when you implement great ideas that aren't previously tested. So rapid cycle innovation is a fabulous tool, not just for IT products, but for processes, for org structures, for incentive structures. It works brilliantly. Before you can implement something like Q-Loop, though, it's helpful to understand how you currently solve problems in your current organization, or how you realize opportunities. So I built this matrix. On the x-axis is understanding the degree to which you believe your solution will contribute to solving an issue or realizing an opportunity. On the y-axis is to what extent you as an organization deeply understand why that issue has occurred, why that problem has occurred, or why that opportunity might present itself. 70% of all organizations are in this first box. We don't understand why the problem occurred in the first place, and we really have no idea how our solution is going to solve the problem. And we call that firefighting. And that's just gathering a bunch of people in a room, throwing them against a task, and eventually, if they're the right people, you're going to find that they're going to come up with a solution. Now, will they understand causality? Probably not. Will the solution stick and be robust? Doubtful. But it will even solve the problem in relatively short order. And some organizations thrive on it. They love the chaos. It's just not sustainable and not good business practice. Certainly not efficient. If we go along the x-axis, so I really understand how my solution will solve the problem, but I don't have the faintest idea of why the problem occurred, nor what the great idea would be. We call that tribal wisdom. So what is that? That means there's a great opportunity for us here. We want to enter a new market. We call George. George is the new market expert. George comes riding in on his big white horse, dismounts, and says, "Okay, folks, minions, tell me the problem. I, George, will solve it for you with the aid of my big white horse." And George solves the problem. Why? Because he's George, and he's got a big white horse. He's an expert. And that's a fine way to solve problems, provided George never goes on maternity leave, provided George never leaves the company, provided the problem is always within George's wheelhouse. So it's a very risky way to solve problems when you rely solely on experts. Young emerging companies typically solve problems this way. Tons of pockets of expertise, bring in George and the horse, they solve the problems, George goes back, organization feels, well, that's gone, until the next problem. But by not codifying this, by not building part of your institutional knowledge, you're always relying on George. The problem with implementing a more robust approach to ideation through change is you're going to have resistance, as we talked about. Who do you think the biggest resistor will be? George. Why? Because the day that all boats rise is the day you take away George's horse. And who is George without his horse? He's a little guy that just solves problems. So he's going to resist tooth and nail. So how do you solve that? You include George. You include George in ideation. Because if you don't, he's going to resist. And we don't want him to leave. Because he has talents that none of us have. If we stay on our current level on the X, we go up the Y-axis too. We have no idea how our solution is going to solve the problem. But we love generating potential ideas. We do, however, have a pretty good insight as to what the marketplace wants or why the problem is occurring. We call this the conference room solution. I call this the conference room solution. It's my least favorite of the 4 boxes. And this is where typically senior management will come down from the mountain. They'll say, I've got an idea. Execute it, my minions. And if you think of the gears, think of big gears that intersect. Large gear, smaller gear, tiny gear. Big gear representing senior management. Big gear moves 1/4 turn. What happens to small gear? Yeah, spins around like a top and finally flies off the flywheel. Because what's so simple to senior management, as we all know who are not senior management, not always quite so simple, making that one little change to a program. Typically, many organizations are run via conference room solution. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then lastly, fact-based analysis, which is collecting data, collecting reams and reams of customer data, processing through a thoughtful fact-based approach, and then bringing it back down for implementation. And that's typically the smallest box in terms of how most companies solve problems. I think this is the enemy to a lot of the work that we're talking about, because this is the de facto way that people solve problems. I live in Connecticut, so I was on the plane right over, and I was reading an article in the Times, and it was about a new approach to solving a crisis in the New York area hospitals. So 3 or 4 hospitals, the big ones, Cornell, Columbia, Beth Israel, they formed a consortium. And they did some really great customer research. All made sense. And so they talked to their patients and said, what'd you like about your stay? What didn't you like? What can we do better? How can we do a better job of servicing you? And one of the major issues from the patient perspective is, I can't distinguish the nurses from all of the other healthcare workers. Logical and makes sense. Hundreds and hundreds of people running around, I can't distinguish them. So they convened a meeting of the minds, the senior executives, and they said, how are we going to solve this problem? And they came up with a solution. Let's immediately order all nurses to wear white. A little 1950s for my taste, but nonetheless, let's order all nurses to wear white. And they went ahead and procured like 1 million nurse uniforms. How well do you think that was received on the part of the nursing community? Not great. But it seems so logical. Nurses, white, pure, clean, sanitized, healthcare, hospitals. Why didn't the nurses like it? Any ideas? Well, it wasn't their idea. And what were their ideas? Well, they had some real concerns. Number one is, white looks great at the beginning of the day. But I'm dealing with bodily fluids, ladies and gentlemen. By the end of the day, it doesn't look white. So it's a disaster to maintain. Number two, white when washed tends to get sheer. Good news for the patients, bad news for the nurses. And the third thing, and maybe most importantly, is they lost their identity. Nurses really enjoyed being able to pick out their own uniforms, their own scrubs. And so they took away their entire sense of identity. So what seemed like such a great idea in the boardroom, when you try to implement it, it was an unmitigated disaster. And that was so easily solvable by simply inviting the actual users of the product, of the idea, into your ideation process. Yet that was never considered. The other reason I don't like the conference room is because it exists so far away from the customers. Howard Schultz, founder and CEO, as you know, of Starbucks, visits 25 stores a month. 25 stores a week, excuse me. 25 stores a week. And when asked, why do you do that? He said, my business is incredibly simple. And I would argue, actually, all businesses are incredibly simple if you let them be. My business is simple. What I do, simply, is I serve coffee to one customer at a time. That's my business. And unless I can go out there and taste it, and smell it, and watch it, and observe it, I'm going to lose track of what really matters to my company. So it's vital that you really get out there and understand what your customers are really looking for. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about how you can use some of those techniques and getting with your customers to maybe shake your idea tree a little bit and maybe give you some new ways to solve, new ways to kind of promote some creativity. And they're a little bit non-traditional. So one of them is what I call impose artificial constraints, or ask what if. What if you lost all of your B2B business tomorrow and you had to only focus on B2C? How would you survive? Conversely, what if you lost all B2C and you became a B2B business exclusively? What if you had to introduce a new product in the next 6 months that would materially add to revenue? What if you lost half of your employees tomorrow night? They were all gone. You went from a company of 50,000 employees to 25 overnight. What would you do? What if you weren't allowed, what if you were unable to gain a single new customer for the next 24 months? What would you do? Now, you may look at me and say, well, that's absurd. Your ideas are not, those constraints are ridiculous. And I would argue, maybe, but what it will do is it'll force you to squeeze every last ounce of value out of what you're doing today. Let me give you a case study. So working for a very large brand name financial services firm, and they were stunted with how to grow. They were really, it cost them as much to acquire a new customer as it did for the revenue. They just couldn't get out of their revenue box, much as they tried. So I said, well, let's try the artificial constraints. And we said, in this case, what if you weren't going to get any new customers? How would you survive? And that caused them to think in ways they'd never thought. They've always been thinking very vertically. They weren't thinking laterally. So they said, okay, well, if we were unable to get any new customers, how do we maximize the value of our current customers? So then they started thinking about share of wallet, which wasn't really a metric they were thinking about in the past. And they said, okay, we need to maximize share of wallet. How might we do that? Well, the way that they were structured was this company sold all of their products through non-dedicated financial advisors. And the entire industry, and it's a mature industry, been around for 50 years, everyone dedicated all of their resources to focusing in on a financial advisor relationship. Why? Because unlike the automotive dealers, these financial advisors were not dedicated to the company. They could sell any product. So unless we had a deep relationship with the financial advisor, we were afraid we would never get any new customers. So all of our offices were located by where all the financial advisors were. However, when we did the artificial constraint of what if, what they then realized, and they did analysis they'd never done before, they realized that the financial advisors typically brought them no more than 2 deals a year. That was it. And because they were a brand name, they were brought to every major deal that there was to be had. This is a B2B kind of business, obviously. So they were brought to every possible deal because of who they were. Yet they closed their fair share of deals. And so the analysis of what if caused them to say, we don't want to close our fair share of deals. We want to close our fair share of deals as well as that of the next 3 competitors. We want it all. And they should want it all. Why not? Well, in order to get it all, they always, the phrase we wound up using were, they always got invited to the dance. They just never took their date home. So the question is, how do you increase the odds of winning once you get taken to the dance? And for them, what they realized was they had nothing interesting to say. They won their fair share of deals because they were the same as everybody else. What if they had something interesting to say? So they decided in a pilot, and pilot is something you're going to hear from me a lot. I love the concept of pilots. Rapid cycle innovation, all about piloting. And it's not just about products, it's about services and even lines of business. What if we pilot a practice model? So think consulting firms or law firms. And we would actually build a practice around machinery, healthcare, high-tech, utilities, what have you. And let's go to the dance with something really interesting to say, not only about the potential client, but also about the industry trends and how we can save them and their participants money. And they launched the pilot. Within 3 weeks of launching the pilot, $1 billion asset signed up with them. And they signed up with them for one reason. They said, finally, someone is thinking and actually shattering industry paradigms. You finally have something to say to me, as opposed to being a commodity provider. We're going to go ahead, and even though we know you're in pilot stage, we're going to support you by transferring all of our business. They launched it in 2013. All of the pilots were, they launched it, in 2012. All pilots were fully installed by the end of 2012. And this client achieved their annual revenue targets for 2013 in March of 2013. And now other folks in the industry, other players, are starting to migrate to the practice model. And it all got there because of the what if, the artificial constraints. So it's a good one. I'd encourage you to really think about how you can maybe apply that into some of the challenges that you guys are facing. Another one, like the what if, is alter your point of view. You clearly have a point of view, and you're more often right than wrong. But altering your point of view can be a really powerful exercise as well. Give you another example. Oh, and I apologize for using financial services again, but it's a good example. This was an insurance company, Fortune 100 insurance company. Been around forever, belt and suspenders organization, extremely conservative. They wanted, head of insurance, wanted to introduce a new product for the senior market. And his challenge to us was, I want you to create for us a game-changing customer experience. From cradle to grave, from the time the customer becomes aware of the product until she uses it and gets it serviced. I want innovation. I want game-changing. They've been at this game-changing concept for this product for about 9 months before we started working with them. And for them, they literally, true story, got as far as changing the color of the stationery from white to ivory in their welcome letter. I wouldn't exactly call that game-changing. It's an interesting example to me because they only knew what they knew. And they didn't have the ability to think beyond their current paradigms. So it's often helpful to bring in a very different paradigm to shake their tree. So example here was Mini Cooper. Early in the year, I bought my wife a Mini Cooper for her birthday. Now, in the category of probably too much information, my wife's a former auditor at JP Morgan, investment banker, so she loves numbers. I can't spend more than $10 without her knowing about it. So clearly trying to buy a car without her knowing about it probably wouldn't pass muster. So I went to the dealership and I said, I want to do this for my wife's birthday. It needs to be a surprise. And quite frankly, I don't have enough cash to pay for this thing, so I need to go through some sort of credit card or write you a check, and here's where the problem starts. He said, don't worry about that. Sit down, relax, have a cappuccino, and let's design your car. I said, okay. As you may know from Mini, there are truly a million different combinations of Mini Cooper that you can design. So we spent about 3 hours having fun designing the car. I then said, okay, there's still the elephant in the room, which is how do I pay for this thing? He said, here's what I'm thinking. Do you have an insurance card with you? I said, I do. He said, may I have it, please? I said, absolutely. Gave him the insurance card, made a copy, came back. Said, it's all done. I said, what's all done? All I gave you was an insurance card and the specs for the car. He said, well, no, it's all done. Your wife's birthday is on 2 weeks from now. Here's my thinking, if this works for you, Mr. Klapper. I'm going to have the car driven over and parked in your driveway at 10 a.m., if that works. It'll have a big red bow, okay? I said, okay, still, it sounds good. And if it's okay with you, what I'd like you to do is I'm going to have the keys there. Drive around, it was a Friday. Drive around for the weekend. Let your wife have some fun. On Monday morning, have her come in or you come in. We'll settle up all the finances at that point. I said, well, do you need a deposit? He said, not necessary. Where are you going to go? You going to steal a car? You don't look like the car theft kind of guy. We'll sell the finances later. Enjoy the car, enjoy the surprise, and happy birthday to your wife. 2 weeks later, I do that, big success. A box comes in the mail, beautifully gift wrapped from Mini to my wife, with stickers and coupons and mugs and keychains and all kinds of things, Mini Cooper membership. And several months later, other boxes came as well to build the affiliation. That's what I would call game-changing customer service. Why shouldn't every single interaction be like that? It didn't cost them a lot more. In fact, I would argue it cost them no more than the crappy dealer or the crappy experience we get when we buy most cars. As I had 3 weeks ago when I bought my daughter a car. It wasn't a Mini, and it was your typical car experience, which was, to put it kindly, suboptimal. We then use this approach to insurance. And you may say, well, wait a minute, insurance? And that's what the team said. We don't have a sexy car like a Mini Cooper. How do we make this work? And we said, well, let's talk about it. What's the first thing that happened on the front end? And you said, well, you had the choice. You had unlimited choice. I said, I didn't have unlimited choice. I had the perception of unlimited choice. There's a big difference. There were 1 million combinations. There were not 1,000,001. Had I wanted 1,000,001, I couldn't get it. So all of the potential combinations were predetermined and costed out. That's a pretty powerful model. Why can't you do that when you offer your insurance product? But give the customer perception of unlimited choice. So that's something they did on the front end. So their sales force went out with iPads with different options and allowed customer to really interact with their agent, which had never been done before. Next thing that arrived was a welcome letter, hand-signed by the head of insurance, welcoming them into this insurance family. Third thing that came out was a stock certificate. This was a security product for senior citizens. They could harken back to the days of when you actually owned stock in a company. Highly rated insurance company, as part of the product, instead of a Mini Cooper, they got a physical stock certificate that actually showed tangibility to what was heretofore an intangible product. Very powerful. They instituted white glove customer service, concierge level service, focused on senior training. And then the last thing was, in the mail, about 3 weeks after taking delivery of the product, they got a blanket with the logo of the insurance company, a security blanket. What did that do? Well, it gave senior citizens a warm feeling about the company. It also was a great marketing tool. So when one senior citizen talked to the other, where did you get the neat blanket? I got it from this insurance company when I bought this product. It became viral marketing. So taking a non-industry example to solve a challenge that you have is a very powerful way to shake paradigm and get people to think laterally. Last example I'll give you on thinking differently is what I call killing the status quo. NewCo. Driving your company out of business. I've done this on the corporate level. I've done it on the department level. I've even done it on the process level. So a company would come and say, we want to go ahead and, how long does your product development process take today? And they'll say, 18 months. And I'll say, okay, that's more than a little bit of time. What would game-changing be? And they'd say 12 months. And so, well, think again, that's not game-changing. How about 4 weeks? And let's say, you don't understand my business. And I said, probably that's a good thing. Why don't we go ahead and design a NewCo process without any constraints that you have today? Forget structure, forget technology, forget anything. Let's see if we can get a product to market in 4 weeks. Cradle to grave. And by employing the principles of dazzle, beguile, astound, and delight, those are always the founding principles of what NewCo would look like. KFC up in Canada had some issues, more than a few. They had 500 stores. Stock price had declined from 13 3/4 down to a little more than $1. The brand had stopped resonating with younger consumers. Traffic was gone. No, they didn't go back to Howard Johnson's, but they were going elsewhere. And they said to us, we need a massive operational transformation. And oh, by the way, our field turnover is 200%. Can you help? So probably, but the last thing I would do is tackle this as a 400 or 500 restaurant store transformation. That's going to fail. Let's pick a store. And let's pick a store and put a charter in place that's about dazzling, beguiling, astounding, and delighting our customers. And let's build a store the way we would want to build a store if this were our company. So we formed a team, 8 people, half-time, 2 constraints. They had 45 days to get the store turned around, and they had a budget of $20,000. That was it. No other constraints. And over the course of 45 days, we had representation from marketing, from product, from R&D, from technology, from sales, from ops, as well as store people. And 45 days later, we opened the store. 300 operational improvements. Products that we took from the test kitchen and launched them. Specials that they'd never done before. New deals, new promotions, door-to-door marketing, sub-zip code marketing. Things they've never thought of before. We put it all into the store. We called it Model Store. And when we launched Model Store went from what was in the bottom decile, no, not bottom, excuse me, it was in the 3rd or 4th lowest decile store to the single highest performing store out of 450 in the entire organization. Same store sales had doubled, average check had doubled, profitability had doubled against any control you'd ever want to measure for this model store. And that became the blueprint for how you roll it out across the entire enterprise. A very powerful concept. Put yourself out of business. Put your process out of business. Put your department out of business. Even put your company out of business. It's a very powerful way to reinvent yourself. And you can do it in a rather risk-free way. Because if this store didn't work, it was 1 out of 450. There's no downside risk. I'm doing it with a company now. They've actually completely decimated the top 2 floors of their office space. And they're building NewCo to put the entire company out of business. What they believe is their business model is starting to fade. They want to test a new concept before they start. They're bare bones staffing it, lean budget, rapid time frame, crazy time frame, and they're bringing over customers one at a time and staffing accordingly until they can ultimately build out this new organization. It's all about lateral thinking. Lateral thinking is extremely difficult. Vertical thinking is easy. So if I were to ask you, what was the name of your elementary school? Could you tell me? Yeah. What was the name of your first pet? Could you tell me that? What was the first street that you lived? Yeah, you're all shaking your heads. It's very easy to recall historical, factual research, because our brains are wired that way. They're wired in a very vertical way. It's when you start to make lateral associations like the ones we just talked about, that's where the mental engine seizes a little bit. Let me put you through an exercise and see if this works. Please think of a waiter. What are the first words that come to mind when I ask you to think of a waiter? Friendly. Busy. What else about a waiter? What other words come to mind? Quick word association. Good memory. Food? Restaurant? So, those are the words that you typically associate with a waiter. Friendly, busy, restaurant, food, tablecloth. Some may say candles. Why did nobody say dump truck? Caterpillar? Dead cat? Why wouldn't those be the words that you would have jumped to when I asked you to think of a waiter? Why friendly, busy, helpful, food? Why didn't I get any votes for dump truck or dead cat? Because those are illogical associations, and I don't typically associate a dead cat with a waiter. And I don't know where you eat, Brian, back in Connecticut, but out in California, that's not the way that things work. True. Typically, you associate a waiter with logical things where you associate with a waiter. But a dead cat doesn't make sense. What I'd like to do, though, is give you another challenge, if you don't mind. Pretend you're a consultant, and you've been hired by a failing restaurant to design a growth strategy for that restaurant. And the only source of inspiration is you must use a dead cat in all of your ideas and thoughts to help the failing restaurant. Knee-jerk reaction to that challenge, real quick. Be honest. Come on. What do you think? It's ridiculous. Why is it ridiculous? They're completely separate. Yeah, and most people have the reaction, that's ridiculous, it's silly, it makes no sense. And in fact, I'm not even going to play. You go back to Connecticut with your dead cat. Very common reaction, thank you. But what I'm going to ask you to do for a second is persevere. Go beyond the ridiculousness. And truly now, put yourself in that consultant's mind and see if you can design a growth strategy using a dead cat as inspiration. Give me some thoughts. Love it. So dead cats versus live cats on food wastage. Perfect idea. What else? Yeah.
If you don't innovate, you become dead as a company.
Okay.
Cats are very agile, reactive. They crawl, they do whatever they need to do to get to wherever they want.
Sure. So build a restaurant that's incredibly flexible, incredibly agile. Be the agile dead cat restaurant. When I've done this before, I've heard things like, what if we cater to cat lovers? And we put some warm milk down on the bottom of every table. So bring your cat, come on over. I've heard Dead Cat Cafe. I've heard lots of different options for how to turn a restaurant into a success story using a dead cat. But your first reaction was the most interesting one, which is this is silly. The reason it's important, and the reason I wanted to take you through the little exercise is because this is what the front line feels when they are given an idea that they have to go ahead and implement that they ultimately don't think is pragmatic, it doesn't make sense. If we have senior management said, here's the idea, implement away, most people's reaction on the front line is resistance. This is ridiculous, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't tie to my mental model. But if you persevere through it, there's often some pretty good goodness on the other side. But it's not easy. Last couple of slides. Resistance exists at all levels. whether it was ridiculousness at the dead caddis story, or whether it's trying to implement a major change through an organization. Most companies just want to avoid it and hope it goes away. It doesn't. It doesn't ever go away. Best case, you'll get active resistance, so at least you know how to help. Worst case, it'll be passive, where people will nod their heads and at the end of the day go back to doing what they're doing. The best way to overcome resistance is to recognize it's there and involve those resistors into ideation and into messaging. So the way that I like to work typically is every project that I work on, whether it's large or small, always has a defined time period, 30 days, never longer. Even if it's a large project, it's the piece of a project with a measurable deliverable within 30 days. People lose interest after 30 days. Management loses interest after 30 days. So 30 days to deliverable. I'd love to have a pilot working within 30 days. Team composition, love it to be no more than 5 to 7 people. Flat out working hard. Think of the analogy of a crew in Skull. When you get to more than 5, 6, 8 people, you have people that are coasting, not people that are working. So I like team size, cap to 5 to 7 people, 30-day deliverable, quantitative mandate. And make sure the people who are ideating are the ones that are ultimately getting response, are going to be responsible for implementing. So make sure the idea comes from senior management, so they buy into it, they resource the project properly, and ultimately it's the doers, the ideators, that are responsible for implementation. And what you're going to find is you're absolutely going to turn resistance into passion, because people love to implement the work that they had a hand in creating. Final thoughts I know these talks happen with tremendous frequency here. And hopefully at some of the better ones, you're able to walk away with an idea too that maybe there was a phrase that said, well, that was kind of interesting. I learned a little something. It was worth giving up my lunch hour to listen to. But what I hope is that you could take something away from this, even if it's just one concept, and try and implement it into your day-to-day job. So depending on where you are in the organization, whether it is senior management and it's about building a committed team and living the change you want, whether it's about you're lower in the organization, you want to hold leaders accountable, whether it's about creating organizational energy around the particular, there's clearly tons of energy here in this building, but around a specific project. Adopt a personal approach. Own the change. I hope that some of the lessons will serve you as you go out and continue your careers. So I wish you the best, and I thank you very much.